Hi guys, welcome back to the Endurance Podcast. How are you doing, Tim? Have you had a good week? What have you been up to?
Hi Tom. I'm actually good. Getting ready for my Grand Fondo that I'm doing on Sunday. Sports for Dolomitic race, 200k and 5,000 meters of elevation. So I'm just getting ready to do my last heat acclimation session before I go to Slovenia and then to Italy in the end of the week. What about you? Enjoying the sun in the UK?
Enjoying a bit of sun, yeah. It's not been too bad. I did a Grand Fondo last weekend, a bit flatter than your one. I think it was 600 meters elevation rather than 5,000. But that was good, nice and fast and flat and fun. Riding with my teammates and that, so that was quite good fun. How's the torture going in the heat chamber? You starting to feel a little bit better?
Yeah, it's actually fun, but I always make it harder every single time. So this is probably something we can discuss in one of the next episodes. The heat acclimation and stuff. Perhaps like for the next season, we are a bit late because the heat has already hit the most of the Europe, so probably not like super interesting for most people at the moment. But so today's topic, I think, is a bit different. So what's on the plan on the menu today?
So we're going to continue not from the previous podcast, but from the one before that, where we were talking about nutrition for stage racing at the more pro level. We're going to talk more of what you can do at an amateur level, and maybe during a training camp when you're intensifying your training over a week or so, compared to what you're used to, and what lessons you can learn from stage racing that you can apply in a training camp situation to help your recovery and performance for that.
Oh, so this is the episode about Haribo.
Every episode is about Haribo, surely. You know that by now. Well, I'm learning that. Lots of Haribo. So I was going to talk about a race I did quite a long time ago now. I think all my anecdotes are from quite a long time ago. When I went over to Ireland to do the Voss, how do you pronounce it in Irish? The Vass, which is a UCI 2.2 level race. So it's still a UCI race, but it can be a mixture of the lower level pro teams and also amateur teams. And that's unlike a lot of races at that level, you do get quite a lot of just club teams and regional teams from Ireland. It's a very prestigious race for those guys. So you could get full-time professionals racing against literally third cats who just want to get around the race. So we were kind of a little bit in the middle of that. We were a regional team from England. And the idea was to do a little bit of a study around it, because we had parameters on the bikes to look at energy expenditure, and we were doing some food diaries to see how the energy expenditure and intake were matching each other. Unfortunately, although we started off with 5 people, we only had 3 who finished, and one of those was a bit of a last minute addition to it, so he didn't have the parameter and take part in the study. So we only got 2 decent sets of data, so it wasn't ideal. We can still talk a little bit around a few conclusions that are still learnt from that. So as I said, we only had 2 people who finished, but kind of the first conclusion was drawn from the one who didn't finish, really, because if you looked at his energy intake versus expenditure, the first 2 days he was really quite a lot under. He was sort of around about 1,000 calories under his energy expenditure, and that sort of dug himself a hole from which he never really recovered from. So even though after that he was sort of encouraged and got the picture that he needed to eat more, I think he retired on the 5th day because he was just empty, not able to continue. So that's like a really good take home message, that something that you can maybe get away with in a 1-day race, you can't get away with in a stage race. So it was something to really bear in mind. And then the second interesting thing that we saw were that even though the other two were sort of pretty well able to match their energy intake and expenditure over the course of the full 8 days, there were a couple of days where there was a long transfer. And those are the days when you saw a bit of a dip in the intake and it didn't quite match the expenditure. So that's something that maybe at a pro level, you don't have such a problem with, because you've got tons of team staff there to look after you on the transfers, etc. Whereas we just had 3 guys there. So it was like a team manager, a mechanic, and one guy who was a soigneur, but kind of mainly driving the van in between places with all our kit as well. So there's pretty limited support there. So, you know, if someone breaks their bike or something, then you've probably got all of the staff trying to fix that rather than look at helping you out with your nutrition. Whereas World Tour level, you've got plenty of staff and they've all got their own particular job, so you're not really going to lose out so much.
Yeah, so like you raise some really like interesting points and really important ones. And when I work with athletes, like not like World Tour athletes, but amateur ones, and like young aspiring athletes that one day perhaps could be World Tour riders, you see this like very often because they kind of obsess about body mass, even like on those 1 week long races. And I think this is kind of a stupid thing to do, because you can't really gain a lot of body mass in like 7 days. And also you can't really compare 7 days or 5 or 4 or whatever day races with like a Grand Tour, because basically the smaller the race and the more teams are participating, probably this means that it's more individual race, so that the power, it goes all out every single day, especially for those less trained riders perhaps, because obviously they are not World Tour riders and they're like coming from a lower category, and the perceived effort is much higher for them than for those like the best riders. And this just means that they really need to fuel themselves very well. And I would personally rather see them in an energy surplus, meaning that they actually eat more energy than they are actually kind of turning over, just so that you really make sure that they are recovering day after day. But on the other hand, what you actually see is probably 2 things. The first one is that they kind of are scared of gaining body mass, especially because usually not in this particular race, but usually you see the mountain stages coming towards the end, like on Saturday, on Sunday, whereas the race starts on like Tuesday or something like that. So they're very concerned over like gaining body mass over the duration of these few days. So they kind of under eating, but they kind of forget about the fact that the recovery is going to suffer. And then the second problem is that sometimes if the race is super hard, they just don't feel the hunger. So they like come to the finish line and I'm not hungry. And they're like feeling, okay, I'm not hungry. I don't need to eat. I can perhaps even lose some body mass, and this is just going to help me going forward. But this is just not how it works, and he clearly kind of demonstrated this with that particular person that was not eating enough. And I think it's really hard, like, to kind of even know how much you need to eat, and the timings of the food intake can be problematic. And very often I hear, well, we finished race, but then we needed to transfer to move to another location. So we haven't been eating for hours. And then they come to the hotel at like 9 p.m. in the evening, and they have the first or the only proper meal of the day. The next day, the start is like 11, 12 o'clock. And they have a breakfast, but basically that's too late and that's not enough to fill up the glycogen store. So it's kind of really, really tricky. But at the same time, it can also be very simple because you can simplify the food intake. You don't need to eat like, I don't know, pasta. You don't need to eat meat. You don't need to eat some proper food. You can actually go with Haribos. And that's why I mentioned Haribos at the start.
At the start, middle, And the end probably, but yeah. Yeah, I think it was, in this particular case, it was maybe more the second option you mentioned, in that he's maybe not used to riding that kind of race. Maybe you did a 160 kilometer race, but that would be a one-off. So maybe not having those hunger sensations, can get away with it a little bit in that. But he wasn't really used to doing that day after day. Well, none of us were really in that team. So it's easy to just miss those natural cues that you get from hunger. Whereas if you're a little bit more clued up about it, you kind of know to, sort of err on the side of eating too much rather than too little. I think is always safest at that level. I know sort of in the Giro a few years ago, Chris Froome planned very meticulously to have a negative energy balance over that first week to lose that last little bit of weight for the mountains. But at that level race, and in most amateurs, that's probably more risk. You're more likely to do more harm than good in a risky strategy like that, I think.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, like trying to lose body mass during a race, it's very risky. Actually, probably like do it only in two like cases. The first one is that you know that the training load you're doing, you're used to it. The body is used to the training load, and that it's kind of easy for the body to recover. And those riders like doing that, I don't know, training camp or a really hard stage race, they are not used to this kind of riding day after day. So this is like a very big kind of stress to them. And this means that they need to refuel. Whereas for like Chris Froome, for instance, or those big guys, some stages can be very easy. And if you kind of plan meticulously the diet and be in an energy deficit when it's still possible to recover, I think that is fine and manageable and doable, but it's very risky. And you don't want to do this in a 1 week race, definitely, or a 5-day long race. So from that perspective, it's something not really recommendable. And also, like in a way, you are coming to the race, like this can be the most important part of your season, or like one of the most important ones. And then you didn't come prepared so that your ideal body weight or body mass, let's be correct. And so it's basically your problem, and you can't solve this problem during a race. It's too late. Just forget it. Recover, and that's the recovery is the most important thing you should be doing.
If you come into it and you're a kilo or two heavier than you should be, it's not the time to deal with that. You've got to accept that and go with making the most out of where you are really then. And especially there was hills in that race, but in the majority of UK races, for example, there's not the amount of climbing that you see in the Tour de France or something, where having those extra 1 or 2 kilos really makes a big difference. It's not such a deal breaker. In the UK race, you're going to do much more harm to your performance by not having enough carbs and holding back and restricting yourself, especially sort of towards the start of the week, and pay for it much later on.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, like even I'm not a big fan of power to weight and changing the weight portion of or the mass portion of the equation. I'm more in favor of changing the watts because I think that's where the gains are to be made. And I think even the professionals are making this mistake. And if I dare, I would probably, looking at Chris Froome these days, recommend him to focus more on gaining the watts back rather than getting the body mass down, because that's where his gains are to be made, in my view. But yeah, that's topic for another day. So for like professional teams usually try to kind of calculate and energy in, energy out. So using the power meters, and you calculate exactly how much you need to have. And this is like very tricky, because if you like look at your power data, you think like you know exactly how much you're actually how much energy you've turned over, and it's kind of you get on it. I don't know. It's usually amount of kilojoules converted 1-to-1 to kilocalories, and this equation, there is a maths behind it, assumes energy, the movement efficiency to be, I think, 25%. So it's then very simple to kind of work out how much energy you need to kind of ingest. But this is far from the truth. So I've done some maths the other day because, well, if you get people into the lab, you will see very different efficiency numbers. So for instance, at 20% efficiency, you get vastly different energy requirements than at 25% efficiency. So I've taken a ride which is 4,000 kilojoules, which is probably what like some riders would be like turning over or like doing amount of work. And then if we take efficiency of 20%, then the energy turnover comes out as 4,800 calories. If we assume the efficiency of 25%, we get an energy turnover of only 3,825 calories. So we are actually talking almost 1,000 calories of a difference. So that's like 250 grams of Haribos or even more than this. So huge difference. And we can't really know or say that's what the the movement efficiency of a certain rider is, even if we get him to the lab and do the tests. Like out there in the nature, everything changes, the cadence changes. You have sprints which are less efficient. You don't really have like erg mode like as you have indoors. So in the end of the day, like doing those calculations and assuming the wrong efficiency can make a huge error on its own. So you kind of have to, though you do the calculations, you have to be very cautious about them. And then you have this kind of error here in the calculations. Then you have the error in the power meters, adding another point of variable, like, I don't know, power meter of like 1 to 2% can make a pretty big difference in the end of the day. And then on the other side of the equation, you also have how certain are we that we exactly know how many calories are in certain foods, because well, those values can deviate as well, and you have some degree of error there as well. And at the end of the day, you're talking about a lot of errors. So I think like just calculating gram per gram doesn't really make sense. So I think it's better to eat a bit more and just be safe. And then, monitoring body mass day after day over like 3 weeks can get you like an idea of what's going on. But definitely, for 1 week stage race, I would just say eat basically as much as you can, and perhaps like follow the recommendations, which are you need around 10 to 12 grams per kilo of body mass per day. And we're not talking about the carbohydrates ingested during exercise here. We're just talking about the carbohydrates for the recovery at rest. And I think that you're fine. Like I usually see like around 10 grams per kilo of body mass of carbs. So 7 grams in recovery and then 3 in the morning. So like 10 grams per kilo body mass and then like 80 to 100 grams per hour during a race. And this kind of makes sense. And usually riders are then well fueled and well recovered after day.
Yeah, I think a couple of things sort of related to the study we did around that was, we did the submaximal efficiency in the lab, but then like you say, obviously that's in the lab. It's not taking into account how your efficiency might change, different cadences as you fatigue over the time throughout the ride. But we're looking at in terms of the intake, the grams per kilo. the two guys who did finish was me. I think I was around 62 kilos or something like that. And then the other guy was a lot bigger. He was sort of 85 kilos. So in terms of grams per kilo, I think there was sort of a 3 or 4 grams per kilo difference between us over the course of the day. And it just shows that when you're a bit of a bigger guy, just how much you have to eat in terms of the volume makes quite a big difference. So again, where something that's just simple, high carbs, Haribo, for example, comes in, it's quite a good addition to that, as well as trying to get that. Because both a 60 kilo guy and a 80 kilo guy are probably going to be taking on similar amount during the race itself. It's more what they're doing in the recovery, and that's where the appetite and getting enough in when you're fatigued after a race is quite difficult.
Yeah, it's kind of, it's very individual, and just starting to think about this, I think makes a big difference. And also one of the things that I see very often and hear very often from the riders is they say, well, we can't eat these amounts of carbohydrates. It's too much. So this is probably down to them not fueling enough in the training in the first place, because obviously even in training, they have hard sessions and they have to fuel somehow. And this kind of tells us that, well, they are probably not fueling enough in the training either, because they are not used to having so much carbohydrates. But on the other hand, just forget about healthy foods, foods that are high in fiber. Just go with as simple as possible, because it's the energy that you're after. It's not about the micronutrients. It's not about the minerals and vitamins. It's basically about the energy, and getting the energy in, enough energy in, is the most important thing that they have to do and achieve. So going with Haribos, perfectly fine. Going with Fanta instead of, potatoes is perfectly fine. Go low in vegetables. Don't eat the salads. Just go with carbs. I think that these are the messages that some nutritionists will say, well, you are very bad nutritionist because you should be promoting healthy diet. But healthy diet can only fuel a normal person not doing exercise. But when we're talking about extremes, we're talking about energy requirements, and these come before the requirements for micronutrients, in my view.
And because, yes, you're eating that huge amount, and you are, a lot of it might be simple sugars, say, but you are still getting quite a large amount of normal foods in there anyway. So you're probably eating as much normal food as an average person on the street. So you're actually still getting your micronutrient and your vitamins and mineral requirements through those 2,000 calories, say, of normal food you're eating. It's the other 2,000 of Haribo, sports products, etc., that haven't got those maybe, but you're still getting your requirements for the day probably.
Yeah, exactly. So if you're talking about energy requirements for a day, 5,000-6,000 calories, and we just take 2,000 calories that are recommended for a normal person, like a healthy diet, this is only 30%, so 1/3. And 2/3 can come from basically simple sugars. It's perfectly fine, because that's how it is. And protein requirements, for instance, don't really go much higher than what we recommend to normal people, especially when we're talking about 1 week stage race. So fat requirements or fat needs can also stay as low as 1 gram per kilo body mass per day. What we actually need to get more of is carbohydrates, and that's basically simple sugars.
Yeah. So then sort of moving on to a training camp situation, that might be something that's more relevant to a lot of people who are listening to this. You've gone away for a week somewhere warm, maybe early in the season. Maybe you're trying to go to altitude, for example, to get some benefits from there. You're probably increasing your training load quite a lot for most people as well. So it's quite a similar situation really to doing the stage race. I guess the difference is you've got to decide how to cater it for yourself. So you can either go self-catered to get yourself an apartment somewhere, or you can go in a hotel where it's all catered for you. So there's benefits and drawbacks to both of those, I think, really. Obviously, in terms of getting all those requirements that we've talked about, maybe it's easier to do that if you're catering yourself, but then you've got that extra stress of shopping, cooking, cleaning up. It's all hampering your recovery as well. So, I mean, personally, I'd rather have all that done for me and just have to think about avoiding and investing. Is there anything you'd say where you've got, tips and advising pros on their training camps that you think could pass down to amateurs organising something themselves?
Yeah, for sure. I usually, in every summer so far, I've done some kind of a training camp myself. Try to get my body to the limits and try to ride as many mountain passes as possible. So for instance, last year I've been for I think almost 2 weeks in Livigno in Italy, riding up and down and trying to compare myself to the professionals that were training there. I think it went pretty well. But yeah, so one of the really important things is, if you're self-catered, is that when you come home after a training ride, that you don't start cooking and only after an hour or so, but basically you get the carbohydrates straight after each and every training session, ideally with some protein. That's why, for instance, Regen that I kind of designed and created for endurance is that's the purpose. So you have the carbohydrates and protein straight after, and then you have time to actually cook a proper meal after it. Because if you miss that opportunity, it's not that you won't get glycogen replenished. It's basically you kind of don't get enough time to ingest all that food anymore, because if you're riding for 7-8 hours a day, then you just simply don't have the time. So then if you cook, you really have to focus on carbohydrates, and that the ratios between carbohydrates and fats kind of get a bit different to what you would have at home, because obviously if you want to maintain the amount of total amount of fats in the diet, you have to kind of just increase the carbohydrate amounts. So you kind of need to really pay attention to, because you want the carbohydrates, not the fats in the diet. And then one of the things is also kind of important is that you kind of plan ahead on what to expect in terms of the food you're getting there in the hotel or on your own. So for instance, when we were in Italy, we were really struggling to get enough protein in the shops, because protein for some reason in Italy is difficult to get. High protein, low fat foods is difficult to get. And I think this could be very similar in France, for instance. So you kind of have to think about this. Perhaps, I don't know, this is where the supplements can actually help you, some powders, and then so that you can get enough protein, that you make sure that you have protein at every big meal of the day, morning, just after riding, then the proper meal after the riding, and then in the evening. So you get that sufficient amount of proteins in, and then it's all about the carbohydrates for the rest. And when you go to a holiday, don't forget to enjoy the food, the local food, but make sure that you kind of think about what your plans are, so that you don't eat something a bit more fatty before a really high intense training session when you the next day want to go to take a KOM from somebody. This just is a no-go.
I wouldn't know about that.
But before an easy day or before a rest day, you simply can afford that, and that's basically recommendable, because you're actually on a holiday, you're enjoying the time. So make sure you also have fun with nutrition, but just think and just thinking about the nutrition rather than just go day by day, I think makes a lot of sense. Just as you think also about the effort, you don't want to go first 3 days just all out. You want to do it steady. Even if you look at the professionals, they have a lot of like easy sessions at the altitude, small amount of intervals. It's more about the riding. And it's kind of funny when you come to training camp to Livigno and then you see all the professionals and then you just drop them and you think like, well, I'm super strong. Yeah. But he's there for 3 weeks.
Into their zones really strictly. Yeah.
Yeah. And so these are the things you need to keep in mind. And well, I remember last year, like after 2 weeks, I was so fatigued. Whereas probably like professional riders would be just in a normal state after 2 weeks, just because their intensity was better managed than mine. So they're also humans, but they just do things smarter, I guess. So don't think you can do it every day all out, even if nutrition is perfect. Not going to happen.
Yeah, I mean, they're used to doing those big long rides back to back, not just for a week or two, but throughout the year, aren't they? So, if you're coming from working full time, especially if you're doing it in, say, the spring when you've not got as many daylight hours in the UK, and then you're heading out to Spain or somewhere for a week, then, I mean, don't suddenly think you can quadruple your hours and get away with it. It's something that, like you say, easing into the week is always much better than starting off really hard and just ending it on your knees. I mean, every year when I take people on training camps, it's always the thing I say: first couple of days, ride into it, take it a little bit easier than you think you can, if anything else, because it's much better to do that and enjoy the whole week than just go out all guns blazing and have a horrible end to the week because you're on your knees all the time and you're riding with people who maybe have taken it a little bit easier at the start of the week and they're riding into it over the course of the week rather than heading downhill. And yeah, I mean, obviously nutrition plays a big role in that as well, but it's also knowing yourself and being comfortable really with backing off when you need to and riding within yourself and knowing when you can afford to push it harder and put yourself in a little bit of a box, but in a controlled way kind of thing. So kind of the composition of the training over the week, I'd always say start off the first day or two a little bit easier than you think you could. If you're going away certainly if you're going away for a week or any longer than that, make sure you're building in some rest days or recovery days within that as well. We always do a super easy day midweek, just ride out to a cafe, sit there and sunbathe for a bit and ride back. Just to, even if you don't feel you need it after 3 days, you'll be glad of it after 5, 6, 7 days later on. And you'll get much more out of the week in general. So you mentioned yourself going to altitudes in Livigno, and especially in the summer, hydration plays quite a big role as well. Are there lots of fountains out there to top up your bottles with, or is it a bit few and far between? I know it can depend a lot from place to place and how built up the areas are and everything.
Yeah, but I can't really remember. But yeah, I guess so, because in the Alps you probably get the fountains. But it's also like Livigno and the region around, it's not super hot because the altitude is very high and it doesn't really get super hot. Like last year, I was then really struggling when I got back to Slovenia because it was much hotter there. And the heat was kind of, I felt it. So I wasn't really like, the water wasn't as big in demand as some other places, but definitely, hydration is super important. And I remember I was doing one ride. So it was actually raining and it was a horrible day, but I really wanted to ride the Stelvio from the Prato side. And the other two guys that I was with, they went back because the forecast was so bad and it was raining, but I just carried on. And then when I got home like after a few hours, I think my body mass was like 3 kilos down to what my normal would have been, even though it was cold.
With 2 full bottles because you just not had anything.
Yeah, and it's like, well, that was a bit scary, like just thinking about it. But yeah, if it was cold, it was just fine. But still, yeah, hydration is super important. You don't forget about it, especially if it's hot. Especially, I guess, for the UK people from the UK, because they're not adjusted or acclimated to the heat.
Although when you're heat acclimated, you sweat more as well. So
yeah, that's the thing. Because with heat acclimation, you can increase the sweat rate by probably 1 liter per hour, and that means that you need to drink more. You get more thirsty, but you just need to also think that, well, I'm heat acclimated, I will need more water, so I have to think about how will I get more water, not just so I usually, in the summer, I usually ride with 750 bottles rather than 500 ones, just because I can have more fluid on me. This kind of makes sense.
All right, so I think we'll probably wind it up then for today. We've been chatting a bit longer than we probably said we were going to. So what we're going to talk about next time, I think you've got your Gran Fondo coming up, so we're going to try and do an episode about that. Is that right?
Yeah, hopefully I survive it and the descent after spending most of the last few months indoors. But it's gonna be fun. So yeah, we can discuss nutrition before the race, during the race. My body mass is far from being what I wanted, but yeah, that's stress. That's life. I'm not perfect, but yeah, we can also touch the heat acclimation stuff. So yeah, plenty to talk about, I guess. And cool. If you have any questions or the audience has any questions, just feel free to comment or drop on us an email or something so that we can also answer some specific questions.
Yeah, that'd be great. So yeah, drop your comments below if you've got any questions for us later on, and we'll see you next time. Thanks for listening.